Most people remember punk. The torn clothing, the safety pins, the sneers, the headlines, the Sex Pistols, the Clash. Even people who never listened to punk know the story. Punk has become mythology, but almost nobody talks about what happened next. And that's strange, because the music that came after punk may have been even more influential. When punk exploded in Britain during the late 1970s, it changed everything. It told young musicians that they didn't need permission. They didn't need expensive equipment. They didn't need years of training. They just needed an idea. For a moment, it felt like punk had won. The old rules were broken. The revolution had succeeded. But every revolution creates a new question. What happens after the walls come down? Imagine standing in the middle of a city after a building has been demolished. The dust is still hanging in the air. The old structure is gone. For the first time, you can see the horizon. That's where musicians found themselves after punk. Not at the end of a journey, at the beginning of one. Imagine being 20 years old in 1978. For years, people had been telling you what music was supposed to sound like. Then punk arrived and smashed those expectations. Suddenly, the map was gone. And that was both exciting and terrifying. Some musicians looked at that freedom and decided to keep doing what they had already been doing. Others saw an opportunity to explore. They began pulling ideas from art, literature, electronic music, funk, dub, and places rock music rarely visited. They weren't trying to preserve punk. They were trying to discover what punk had made possible. That search became post-punk. And nowhere would that search become more influential than Manchester. Think about a rainy evening in Manchester in 1979. The streets glisten beneath orange streetlights. Factories are closing. Unemployment is rising. Entire neighborhoods feel uncertain about the future. The city carries a weight to it. Inside a small venue, a crowd gathers. Many of them are expecting another punk band. Instead, they hear something strange. The drums sound mechanical. The bass carries the melody. The guitars drift through the room like distant signals. And then, Ian Curtis begins to sing. The energy changes. This isn't music trying to start a riot. It's music trying to describe a feeling. Joy Division sounded like the emotional aftermath of punk. The moment after the shouting ended. The moment when people were left alone with their thoughts. For listeners, it was something entirely new. Punk had often been about anger. Joy Division was about atmosphere. And atmosphere would become one of post-punk's greatest gifts to modern music. If Joy Division represented atmosphere, another band would help define emotion. Around the same time, another young musician was discovering a different path. Robert Smith. Picture a teenager listening to The Cure for the first time, not because they wanted rebellion, not because they wanted confidence, but because they wanted to understand how they felt. If punk had often celebrated certainty, Smith seemed more interested in uncertainty. His songs explored loneliness, melancholy, fear, and hope. The complicated emotions that people experience but don't always talk about. The Cure helped prove that vulnerability could be powerful. A song didn't need to sound tough to matter. It could sound fragile. It could sound deeply human. And listeners responded because they recognized themselves inside the music. But post-punk wasn't only becoming more emotional, it was becoming more experimental. Perhaps the most symbolic moment in the entire story happened when the Sex Pistols collapsed. If punk had a face, it was Johnny Rotten. And when the band fell apart, many people expected him to simply start another punk band. Instead, he formed Public Image Ltd. The music was stranger, more experimental, less interested in satisfying expectations. Imagine being a fan expecting another version of the Sex Pistols. What you heard instead was something unfamiliar, something difficult, something new. And in many ways, that's exactly what post-punk was. Not a rejection of punk, not a continuation of punk, an evolution. The realization that freedom meant more than breaking rules. Freedom also meant creating entirely new ones. One of the reasons post-punk remains difficult to define is because nobody involved seemed interested in defining it. Wire stripped down songs to their essentials. Gang of Four blended punk energy with funk rhythms. Talking Heads mixed art and experimentation into something uniquely their own. Every band seemed to be conducting a different experiment, and every experiment produced a different answer. The movement wasn't becoming one thing, it was becoming many things. That diversity became its strength, because once musicians realized there was no single destination, the possibilities became endless. This is where the story becomes truly remarkable, because post-punk didn't simply create great bands, it created entire worlds. Imagine standing at a crossroads. One path leads toward goth rock, another leads toward dream pop, a third stretches toward shoegaze, a fourth disappears into the shadows of darkwave. At first, those genres may seem different, but if you follow them backwards, they often lead to the same place. Atmosphere, emotion, experimentation, the willingness to ask new questions. Those ideas spread outward through alternative music like ripples in water, and they never really stopped. Many genres belong to a particular decade. Post-punk doesn't. Its influence is still everywhere, because post-punk was never really a sound. It was an attitude, a willingness to step into unfamiliar territory and see what might be waiting there. So what happened after punk succeeded? The answer wasn't another revolution. It was exploration. Punk taught musicians that they didn't need permission. Post-punk taught them they didn't need rules. And once that happened, music could become almost anything. Dream pop, shoegaze, darkwave, indie rock, entire landscapes of music emerged from that freedom. That's why post-punk still matters. Not because it followed punk, but because it showed